Welcome back, Life Science learners, to our final segment. In this segment, we're looking at some of the applications of what we've just discussed. As a recap of what we've just completed, we've looked at water, we've looked at factors that affect the quality of water, we've looked at algal blooms, we've looked at eutrophication. And before we got into a break, I spoke about how portable water is in our taps. Now let's look at the application of that with a few questions. So when we look at a study that was done, a group of learners were looking at conducting an investigation. Let's read what they've done. So a group of learners conducted an investigation to determine the average amount of water used by a household for different purposes. They collected data on water use from 5 different families in their neighborhood. The results are shown in the table on the next slide. So guys, it's a simple routine kind of investigation that was done where a few learners got together and they went around collecting data. And it's amazing how you, from collecting data, can get a better understanding of trends or the way something is being used. So what better way to see the impact that we have on the environment? Let's do a simple experiment, and that was their objective. So let's look at what information they collected from their investigation. So they tried to establish what was the purpose of which water was used, and so they looked at different criteria that water was being used for, and they also asked the participants or their households to measure the average amount of water that was used. And so this information was collected for 1, the flushing of toilets, 2, the bath and showers, 3, gardening, 4, washing clothes and dishes, and cooking and drinking water. And they measured that average amount of water as a percentage of what these households used. So if you look at the data table, you will see that there's a large percentage of water that's being used for flushing. And then we see a significant amount, almost a quarter of the water that we used in their households were used for baths and showers. And we see that percentage was used for gardening and probably for keeping their lawns, or probably if they've had vegetables growing. We see that 20% of it was used for washing clothes, and cooking and drinking was a significantly smaller percentage. What's interesting to remember and to link this to is that in most households, the most amount of water that is being used is for the flushing of our toilets. And if you think and reflect on that, often when we use the bathroom, we tend to have a complete flush, and we often spend probably 10 to 12 liters of water flushing down after we've used the bath. Now that often means that when we use the bath, every time a family member uses that bath, every time you flush, we do spend a large amount of water that has to be used to ensure that the bathrooms are clean. However, we've also got much more developed and more modern energy and efficient water-saving flushing mechanisms that reduce the amount of water that's being used. And I suppose this is a behavior change, as well as looking at how we've got now more modern and more advanced mechanisms and plumbing features that allow us to save water. And if you want to conserve water in your household, try and look at how much of water is actually being used to flush down when we are flushing our toilets. Okay, so this is what they collected, and again, very important exercise in terms of establishing actually where is most of the water being used. So a few questions that they had to put together that they had to respond to. So firstly, in this study, identify the following. So the dependent variable. And so guys, when we look at this table, we can see that the investigation was carried out to look at what was the purpose for which water was used and the average amount of water that was used, and that was calculated as a percentage that we see. What's important to understand is that in any experiment, there are several variables that are used, and we have the independent variable, we have the dependent variable, and we have a whole lot of control variables. And in this investigation, the question that you asked to determine the dependent variable is what is being measured that helps us to draw a conclusion or to collect data. And clearly in this investigation, it was the average amount of water that was used, and that was converted to a percentage. So our dependent variable in this experiment is the average amount of water used, and that was in a percentage. So the average amount of water used. There was the dependent variable. Hold on if you got that. The independent variable is essentially what is being investigated. What is it that these learners had control over in terms of trying to find information about? So they decided to find out information on what is the purpose of the water being used. So they established that that was going to be their independent variable. So the different uses of water, or the purpose of water, is the independent variable. So it was the different purposes of water. So we could call that the different purpose of water. And you can see that they went around to those 5 households and they established exactly what were the purposes that water was being used for, and they were able to measure the percentage that was being used. So that's quite an interesting question, and it's important to establish that at the onset of an experiment. The next question reads, state 2 ways in which the reliability of the results can be improved. Now guys, remember that in any investigation, the results that you collect are generally looked at and reviewed. So when we talk about scientific skills, we've got to reflect on our investigation and talk about the reliability. If you read the preamble to this, these learners went to 5 households and they collected information in their neighborhood. The question that is now relating to how reliable is this information and how can we improve this? Well, firstly, we got to give the learners the benefit of the doubt, is that in that they've gone around to 5 households and they've not just looked at an individual house. However, we can also comment on whether this information is reliable in the greater context of the neighborhood. All they did was they sampled 5 households. Maybe in terms of to improve the accuracy of their results, they could look at sampling a larger number of households for probably the entire street or individuals in different streets. And I suppose their objective was to establish what was the trend, what was the use, what is the behavior of individuals. And hence, the more samples they used, the more reliable their results become. And I think that is very important in terms of improving any scientific experiment. It's being able to increase the reliability by looking at sample size and the range that we're looking at. Excuse me. Okay, so the next question. Draw a pie chart to represent the data in the table. Show all your calculations, and that's a 7-mark question. And guys, this takes us back to those lessons where we've discussed the scientific skills and we discussed how data needs to be presented. And in this question, they point us specifically to presenting the information in a pie chart. So the question is, why would they want us to illustrate that information in a pie chart? Often, pie charts are graphical illustrations that show you the proportions of the different components that make up a study. And this example requires that we illustrate the percentage use of water in a pie chart. And that would give us a visual representation of how water is being used. So, and again, the question requires that you show your data. So let's look at how this is calculated and then how we plot that. So the calculations for proportions for each slice are shown in the pie chart below. Remember that it is important for us to first, because this is given to us in a percentage, we've got to work that out as a proportion out of 360. So remember that there was 30% used for flushing, so that's 30 divided by 100 times 300, and that gives us a value of 108. And we use the same rationale for calculating the 25% as a proportion of 100, and we multiply that by 360 because we know that a pie chart has 360 degrees, and so that gives us 90 degrees using your protractor. Gardening was 15%, and that equates to 54 degrees on a protractor. And washing clothes and dishes again was 20%, which is 72 degrees on a protractor. And cooking in water, which was 10%, was then converted to a degree using a protractor of 36 degrees. So that's essentially the calculation. So when constructing a pie chart, it's important that we add the total number of the dependent variable. In this case, We were fortunate that it was in a percentage. We add that up and we calculate that as a proportion out of 360. So in this case, we converted that proportion to a percentage or a degree out of 360. And we've got to use our calculator so that we ensure that our calculations are accurate. Remember that we've got to round up or round down to ensure that we don't have the degrees exceeding 360 or being less than 360. So remember to total and use these as a rounding up and rounding off at the end. So add these up to see if they equal to 360 so that you have them proportionately correct, and then you plot that into a pie chart. Now let's look at a pie chart. Again, I've illustrated the percentages up here so that we can look at that. Remember that the golden rule is when we start drawing a pie chart, find a central point from which you can place your protractor. Place your protractor over that area and then extrapolate using your protractor, and establish for the first proportion in this case was 108, and so you count that out and you place a line here and you draw that first segment out, and then you then transfer your protractor to using that as the base, and you now measure the next angle, which is 90 degrees from that, and so that takes us to the next proportion, and you then continue doing that until you have plotted each of the 5 or 6 segments collectively into a complete pie chart. And so here is a visual representation using color of how those are presented. What's important is if your teacher was marking this, that they were going to look for the heading, and the heading in this case shows you the average amount of water used for households for different purposes, so that's a complete heading. It's a pie chart that shows that. We've got a key that illustrates what the different components are, and we've got these proportionately distributed, correctly calculated. So the proportions and the segments are measured accurately. That would be the 3 marks that you would get for that. And so it's important that you use the key in presenting a pie chart, and that allows, again, for the reader to be able to understand what these different symbols or colors or proportions illustrate when looking at the dependent variable. Cool. Okay, describe one advantage of making the results of their survey available to the various households that participated. So guys, the objective of the investigation was to look at the behavior of individuals or the 5 households in terms of what was the purpose or how did they use water. And I suppose in carrying out an investigation, it's important that you share your information so that individuals are able to understand the context of why that investigation was done. And often I think this is a very good idea, that if you've gone around and collected information of something that's very important, in this case the use of water, people often not able to do this are able to see the impact or the way and manner in which they use. So I would certainly think that it would be an excellent idea for them to be able to share their results. 1, for people to be able to reflect, and 2, for them to get a better understanding of what the general trend of 5 households are. And this could lead to an understanding of individuals, a change of behavior, and probably a better understanding in the context of individuals and their impact on their environment. Cool. Describe one advantage, and I just did that. So we said the greatest water was allowed them to develop strategies to reduce the water use in that area. And again, if you looked at that, if individuals were aware that they were using a lot of water to flush down their toilets, they probably would find a new mechanism, a more modern mechanism that reduces the amount of water that is being flushed down the toilet to ensure that they're saving water and they're using water more wisely. Great. Okay. So the next question, describe how alien plants may reduce both the availability and the quality of water. Now guys, as I discussed early on, I mentioned that alien plants are plants that are not indigenous to an area. And so these plants are brought in by different people into an environment that is not natural to them. Often it's carried by people that have settled into an area, either intentionally by bringing plants or accidentally through seeds. And those plants established in an area where they can grow much easier. And so these plants would affect the availability of water. So you'll find that alien plants may use excessively more water, and this would reduce the amount of water available for natural vegetation in that area. And this means that now you are reducing the availability of water to indigenous plants. Alien invasive plants also block waterways, reducing light to the other aquatic plants. These plants eventually die and decompose. The bacteria that decompose these plants eventually deplete the oxygen supply in the water and further affect the quality of water in an area. Before we wrap up, one last question. Describe how poor farming practices may reduce both the availability and the quality of water. And guys, it's important to understand that a large amount of water is used in farming. And so for us to be able to effectively save water but ensure that water is used in the correct way to ensure that there is maximum productivity, we need to look at ways in which that processes can be refined and made much more conservatively to ensure maximum and best use of water. Okay, so overgrazing leads to soil erosion, and hence you can see that when the soil is eroded, water runs off rapidly from the surface and is not absorbed into the soil. So having vegetation slows down the movement of water, and that allows for more water to be able to absorb into the surface. So it's important that we prevent overgrazing. Okay, the use of fertilizers and pesticides may pollute nearby dams and water and rivers, reducing the quality of water available. And we saw that with eutrophication. So these are two simple mechanisms that can ensure that the quality of water, as well as the use in the way the use of water can be better, or better kind of, I think, used by farmers to ensure that there's reduction in the amount of water available. So guys, I'm rushing to finish this section. I know that you guys are there waiting for your next glass of potable water. I want to end off this section and wish you well, and I hope to see you guys in the next section when we talk about the impact that humans have in terms of food security in the environment. Take care, go well, drink lots of water, stay healthy. Goodbye.